What is history? Seems obvious, right? It's the past. It's that subject at school where you have to memorise a bajillion facts and dates and write so much in the exam that it feels like your arm's going to fall off 5 minutes in. Well, I'm here to tell you that that's wrong. School has lied to you. History is not about memorising facts and dates, and World War I was not caused by a sandwich. I'll explain more about that later. So, if history isn't about that, then you might be wondering, what is history? Whilst no one can exactly agree on the specifics, the job of a historian is essentially to try and understand the past as close as possible to how it actually was. What was going on when in the past, and importantly, why was it going on? To try and work out what was going on, historians use sources. Sources are pieces of evidence left from the past that historians can still get their hands on today. A source can be anything. It could be a letter, a book, a newspaper article, a video, or even a 1,000-year-old broken pot. Speaking of broken things, that's one of the challenges of history. Unlike science, you can't test history in a lab. There are no time machines, so you can't go back in time and conduct experiments or observe past societies. And in the course of time, things get lost, damaged, destroyed, and changed, so you only have some evidence left from the past in the present, and not all of it. To make matters worse, everyone in the past was biased. Every source was written by someone, and everyone is biased. There's no such thing as an unbiased or neutral source, and every book, every letter a historian uses is teeming with opinions, even if the person writing it is pretending that they aren't being biased. To make it simpler, let's imagine a fight breaks out on the school playground and the teacher isn't there. They get told about it afterwards, and both people involved say the other person started the fight because they don't want to get into trouble. One of them has to be lying, and it's the teacher's job to work out who, using the evidence. For example, what do the other people have to say? Who would be more likely to start a fight based on how they've acted in the past? That kind of thing. That's a bit like a historian's job, trying to work out what the truth is, even when everyone is biased and you don't know who is telling the truth and who isn't. But that doesn't mean that history doesn't have facts, though. In our example, no one's going to deny that a fight took place. That's a fact. The thing about history is you can never know anything for absolute certain. It's all just people's opinions on people's opinions about what happened in the past. And sometimes it's even people's opinions on people's opinions on people's opinions about what happened in the past. But that doesn't mean it's all wishy-washy. For example, with our example of the fight, if the teacher knew that Byron was bullying Earl Tosti, and every other student on the playground saw that it was Byron that started the fight, then it's very reasonable for the teacher to assume that Byron is lying if he says he didn't start the fight. Even if the teacher can't ever know for absolute certain, because they weren't there to see it, they can be very, very close to certain. Once a historian has looked at the evidence, they'll try and make an argument. They'll ask themselves questions like, why did this happen? And what caused it to happen? And they'll then make an argument based on the evidence. To do this, they'll look at what other historians have had to say on the matter. Do they agree with what the other historians have had to say? Do they disagree? Or do they think that they've missed something entirely? Historians, therefore, you could say, are biased, but it's good to be biased. Have you ever been told at school before to write a balanced argument? If we were to write a balanced argument about this fight between Byron and Earl Tosti, listening equally to what they both had to say, then we'd come to the conclusion that nobody started the fight, which definitely isn't true. Not only is it wrong, but it also has consequences. Let's say Byron is the aggressor who started it. Now he gets to walk away scot-free and is free to start more fights with Earl Tosti in the future, in the knowledge that he'll probably get away with it in the future too. In other words, balanced arguments are nonsense. It's good to be biased because both sides can't be right at the same time, and we want to get as close as we possibly can to the truth. That's what historians are trying to do. History is all about arguments and opinions. How we view history, and the stories and meanings that we assign to it, affect how we view and understand the present day, and the things that happen in it. Therefore, it's vitally important that we get it right. Hitler, for example, was able to use arguments based on history to convince people that the Jews were a menace to society and that they deserved to be slaughtered and tortured. It's incredibly important that we understand when people are trying to create narratives and justify things using history so that we can work out where the truth actually is. Speaking of stories, have you ever heard how World War I was caused by a sandwich? I remember my history teacher telling me this story, not naming any names. It's Bosnia, 1914. Gavrilo Princip and his friends have just failed their attempt to assassinate Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The grenade they threw blew up under the wrong car, the one behind the one the Duke was in. Failed assassination attempts are hungry work, so, feeling a bit peckish, Gavrilo decides to pop down the local shop and buy a sandwich. As he stood outside eating his sandwich, by pure chance, Franz Ferdinand's driver takes a wrong turn and drives past the sandwich shop. Princip quickly pulls out his gun and shoots the Archduke dead. This assassination then triggers the start of World War I. It's a brilliant story, isn't it? World War I, caused by a sandwich. But that's the thing about it being such a brilliant story, is that that's exactly what it is. Just a story, because it's not true. It's true that he assassinated Franz Ferdinand, and that was a trigger for World War I. But let's start at the beginning. The sandwich. Seems believable, right? We all nip into our local Tesco Express every now and again to pick up a meal deal. And after all, assassination attempts are probably hungry work. Well, I hate to break it to you, but there were no meal deals in Bosnia back in 1914. In fact, whilst it may seem completely normal to you or I as a 21st century Brit to pop into our local shop to buy a sandwich, different places at different times have different things that are normal. And sandwiches just weren't really a thing back then in Bosnia. In fact, even more damning, the first mention of the sandwich only appeared in 2001 in a fictional novel. So, even if we ignore the fact of the sandwich, that it probably wasn't a sandwich that he ate, then there is still something fundamentally wrong with this interpretation, and that is its simplicity. If you shoot a random person outside your local Tesco, the chances of it causing a world war are close to zero, and that's because the important thing here is the context behind it and who was shot. There were massive growing tensions in Europe at the time, and Franz Ferdinand was a figurehead of the Austro-Hungarian state. His assassination triggered the war, but it didn't cause it. History is much more complicated than that. The point is, these narratives might sound fun, and they might make excellent stories, but the thing about history is that it's extremely messy and extremely complicated, and it's important that we treat it as such. Things can't be boiled down into a single factor, and certainly not one as simple as a sandwich. And when people do try to boil things down into simple narratives and stories, and never make it clear that there's a bigger picture, be suspicious. That said, you can't have history without bias and opinion. History is inherently political. It has modern-day implications for our current world and is in large part the politics of the past. You can't separate history from politics. Unbiased history does not exist. Facts can't speak for themselves, they have to be interpreted. And anyone who tries to convince you their history is unbiased or objective is lying. Even school has arguments and opinions hidden within the history that it teaches. For example, on literally the second page of the Weimar and Nazi Germany textbook, it says this: "Communism is an extreme form of government in which representatives of the workers set up a government and take over ownership of all land, property and resources in a country. It was associated with Germany's enemy, Russia." That's not true though. Ask any communist how they'd define their ideology, and they'd say land and property would be owned by the community, not the government. It sounds like a small detail, but it completely changes how you think about it. This definition gives off the impression that everything would be owned by the government, even your toothbrush. Communism as a political ideology has never advocated for collective ownership of your toothbrush. In fact, they'd be much more likely to define their ideology as something like a society set up in such a way as from each according to his ability to each according to his need. Or, more simply, where everyone gives as much as they're able to so that they can have as much as they need. That certainly doesn't sound as extreme as the textbook is pushing. Perhaps it makes it a little bit more understandable why so many people throughout history have been so supportive of communism. While there are definitely flaws and very valid criticisms of communism, it's a lot more complicated than just an extreme form of government. In fact, what you see here is bias. The GCSE textbooks are written for a history curriculum set by the British government, and, shockingly, the British government has a bias. Throughout history, The British government has opposed communism, so it's no wonder that they want to make it seem unappealing to their people. Even in school, every telling of history you encounter has an argument and a bias hidden underneath. It's trying to make you view the past in a certain way and draw certain conclusions. Maybe it's as subtle as teaching you one part of history far more than others. Maybe it's bigger, like ignoring the bad things the country you live in has done in the past. Maybe it's the ideas for how events are interpreted that they offer you. It can be many things. It's not a bad thing to be biased, though, because there is a truth that exists and you want to get as close as possible to. But you should also be aware that everything is biased, because sometimes it will be trying to mislead you. It's important that we get as close as we possibly can to the truth, because history can be used to justify some pretty horrendous things. And it's also important to remember that history is messy and complicated, and can't be explained in neat little stories or categorised in neat little boxes. And we also need to remember that we can never know for 100% certain what the truth is, but we can get damn close. Or, as a history lecturer of mine put it in my first year of uni, history doesn't have right answers, but it does have wrong ones. What is history, then? It's kind of like being a detective. It's about taking what remains of the past, our crime scene, if you will, and trying to work out what happened, why it happened, and what were the consequences and implications. It's not about memorising facts and dates, or telling fun stories. It's about getting as close as you possibly can to the truth, whilst acknowledging that you can never be 100% certain. That's what history is. At least in my opinion.